With that, I think I can turn it over to Peter if you're ready, sir.
Yep. Yep. I enjoyed the previous talk by Walter Borneman about the War of 1812. It's, in a way, it's an ideal war because Canadians, the British, and the Americans were all convinced that they won the war. I guess the only losers were the Aboriginal people. Now, I want to talk a bit about start off by talking about the origins of my social and cultural history. When I was an undergraduate in the 1960s, social histories were a pastiche of excerpts from documents, private letters, and travelers' journals. And it was up to the author to decide what was typical and what was exceptional, but without any real certainty. What changed my attitude was a book by Jean Hamelin called Économie et Société en Nouvelle-France, which was published in 1960. And Jean Hamelin showed how one could identify the typical or characteristic by statistics. New France had a very well-documented population. There were a series of censuses starting in 1666. The only risk is that some of the sources of information or data was collected without anticipating the desires of historians who might want to use them as a basis for an argument. And for example, Jean Hamelin created a table showing the flow of indentured workers to New France. When I did some research in France itself, I found that some of the passenger rolls and the indentures were falsified to satisfy laws requiring that each ship going to the colonies would carry a quota of workers. So in fact, the number of immigrants is really uncertain. I would guess it's somewhere around 11,000, but that's only an educated guess. So my technique was basically to try and establish the commonplace or the normal with statistics, and then to provide a representative example to illustrate what was characteristic at the time. The notarial archives of Quebec were a very rich source of material. The notarial system was highly developed, and I could use the contracts to establish social patterns such as the operation of private apprenticeship contracts. And that system was very well developed in the colony. Another source that I made use of that I think historians should use more frequently were archaeological reports. And they could often correct documentary accounts. An illustration of that is that people who relied on estate inventories that were made after the death of a person and would assume that these were comprehensive accounts of all the possessions owned by the deceased person. And they, with a few exceptions, they found very few religious artifacts, unless perhaps it may be a crucifix made of ivory, and that would show up in the inventory. And the conclusion that was drawn from that was that the piety and the religious convictions of the colonists in New France were perhaps not as strong as we'd imagined. But when we turn to the archaeological finds, we find numerous religious medals, rings, and small crucifixes. And this is true of Fort Michilimackinac, whose archaeological reports I treasure. Obviously, these small religious objects were of little material value, maybe of spiritual value, and that's why they weren't included in the inventory. So archaeology is a very good supplement. Now, some of the themes that I picked up on were starting with the relationship with the native peoples. French colonists and later generations of Canadians didn't experience the same series of wars against the Aboriginal peoples that affected the United States. And that's not due to the fact that we're lovable people, maybe we are, but it's really a result of the nature of the Canadian frontier. When the French began settling in the St. Lawrence Valley in the early 1600s, there was no trace of the Iroquoian villages that Jacques Cartier had encountered in the 1530s. We don't know what happened to the native population in the St. Lawrence Valley. Was it war? Was it spread of European diseases? But whatever the case, the French found themselves in an area that was vacated, and there was no conflict over the land. The French settlement was also contained by the seigneurial system. You really couldn't legally occupy land without a seigneurial grant. And the seigneurial system was confined to the valley, and that prevented a steady westward expansion of the agricultural frontier. You really couldn't occupy land by squatting. The Canadian frontier during the French regime and for decades later was a fur trading frontier. And the Aboriginal people, the Native Americans, were essential partners in that trade. They were also courted by the French because the French needed military allies. The French population in New France at its height was about 70,000 people, which was minuscule compared to the British North American colonies. So the French valued the natives both as trading partners and as military allies. Good relations were also a prerequisite for the work of the Roman Catholic missionaries that were spreading among the native tribes adjacent to the French settlements. Because of their dependence on the Aboriginal people, it was the French who had to learn Aboriginal languages and not the natives who had to learn French. One of the very, very few native borrowings from the French language was the greeting bonjour, which Algonquians rendered as bonjour. The law courts in New France also had to defer to the native Indians' view of criminal responsibility. When an intoxicated native Indian committed a crime, including murder, his people blamed the liquor, not the individual. French judges accepted this defense and only prosecuted the whites who had sold brandy to the offender. Were the French racists? Emphatically no. They admired the physique and the dignity of the Indians. One writer said that if you were to dress a native in European clothes, he could walk the streets of Lisbon without being noticed or remarked upon. I don't know what this says about the French view of the Portuguese. There were native practices that were profoundly disturbing, such as the Iroquoian practice of torturing captives with fire and knife, and then engaging in ritual cannibalism as they ate the roasted parts of the victim. The French government, however, encouraged intermarriage between the Aboriginal peoples and the colonists, and they hoped that a hybrid population that was French-speaking and Roman Catholic would develop from this intermixture. So you could say, well, the French were ethnocentric, but they weren't racist. The Indians, on the other hand, found the appearance of the Europeans repulsive. The newcomers had pale, dog-like eyes, not warm brown eyes, and their hair was unnaturally blonde, red, or brown, and even curly, which is something that the Aboriginal people had not encountered. Their hair was usually straight and black. They were particularly struck by the facial hair of the Europeans, which they ridiculed, and they likened the French to dogs and rabbits. When the French made their first fumbling attempts to speak an Aboriginal language, their incapacity to express themselves well was taken as evidence that the French were intellectually inferior to the native peoples. So given these perceptions, native self-esteem was not disturbed or shaken. I want to talk about the behavior of the immigrants. We who are the descendants of immigrants who settled in North America see immigration from the old world or where we came from as a voluntary and hopeful movement of people, and always with the intention of making a permanent home abroad. This attitude was not shared in France. Immigration and settlement abroad was considered a highly unnatural, even an irresponsible thing, because you would be absent and unable to give assistance to your relatives. The migration to France included very few families and very few self-financed migrants. Most of the people came as sponsored immigrants. They were either soldiers or indentured servants. They saw their residence in the New World as a temporary exile. Most intended to return to France. And in fact, 2/3 of the migrants did exactly that. They did not stay in the colony after their term of service had expired. Government officials were alarmed by this flow back to France. They expected these migrants to populate the colony, and this was contrary to the Crown's intentions. And so local colonial officials were told to hinder this movement back to France as much as they could. And they dispatched single women, mostly orphans, to the colony to marry bachelors and thus to keep them in the colony. The same device of sending out potential brides was used in French Louisiana. The migrants to New France were not religious refugees and they weren't political dissidents. Such people were unwelcome. One had to be a Roman Catholic or a convert to that religion to receive a land grant, to marry, and to settle in the colony. A few Protestants who submitted to conversion regretted their choice and fled to the English colonies where they could live among fellow French-speaking Protestants at New York or New Rochelle. The French colonists were not willing innovators. They tried to reproduce the social and cultural patterns they had known in France. Civic self-government was not allowed to reappear in the colony. The government quashed any move in that direction. Parish councils or Fabrique were managed, these are bodies of 3 men who managed the physical assets of a Roman Catholic parish. They were elected by male colonists, but that's the only instance in which you have an elective office in the colony. Because Acadia on the Atlantic seaboard was neglected by the French government, settlers there were free to create their own communal organizations and to choose their spokesman. Well, despite their social conservatism, the colonists did evolve in ways that distinguished them from the peoples of France. These distinctions are not national distinctions, they're what you might call provincial distinctions, much like, say, the Gascons in France were characterized as being by nature boastful. The visitors from France admired the French spoken by colonists in New France because it came very close to the administrative language based on the Francais spoken in Ile-de-France, where Paris is located. The governing administrators, however, described the Canadians as being vainglorious and undisciplined, and they're considered very poor prospects as servants. These qualities, the authorities believed, were derived from the Canadians' association with the Indian population. The Aboriginals followed their own ways and took no orders from the French. The Acadians were characterized as being exceptionally stubborn and poorly educated. When marriage was contemplated, colonists objected to if the future spouse was regarded as a social inferior. Among the immigrants, there was a suspicion that many of the newcomers had come to North America to escape a criminal past. And that's true of some. A few hundred convicts were sent to Canada in the 1720s. These were petty criminals who were convicted of selling untaxed salt, engaging in smuggling. They were vagabonds, or they'd been caught poaching wild game in France. A small number were ne'er-do-wells who were actually sent into exile by their own families. In 1725, the Bishop of Quebec objected to these exiled prisoners, saying that they would lower Canadian society to the level of Protestants and infidels. Despite the bishop's objections, the authorities did tolerate the presence of a few Protestant merchants in the mid 1700s because they were vital to the colony's import-export trade. Colonists were extremely class conscious. The notion of an egalitarian rural society doesn't fit. Social ranks also were very well defined. Marriage contracts made before a wedding, this was conventional in the French colonies to make a marriage contract. The contract included something called the prefix dower. This is not to be confused with a dowry, which the bride brings. The dower was specified to be a certain amount of money to be paid to the widow if the husband died. And these cash amounts of the dower, when you matched them with occupations, were remarkably consistent. I took 125 marriage contracts, arranged the dower in sequence, and that's in the book, and the hierarchy of trades and occupations was revealed. For example, for farmers, 300 livres was the common prefix dower. There were some odd or surprising biases in this social structure. Ordinary soldiers who were in France regarded as slightly better than criminals were given greater social value than tenant farmers who had land. Those who worked with valuable materials, such as silversmiths, had much higher standing than those who labored with humble materials, such as carpenters. Colonists paid lip service to a fixed social hierarchy while trying to better their own standing by acquiring an estate or finding employment in the royal administration. Canadian merchants weren't real capitalists. They were in business to acquire the capital to allow them to buy an estate or to acquire the trappings of an aristocrat. Detroit's founder was in this category. Antoine styled himself Sieur de la Motte Cadillac, and he has been immortalized by General Motors, whose Cadillac bears Lomé's imaginary coat of arms. Family solidarity was important. French Canadians tended to operate within family networks rather than cooperate with people from other families who were not relatives. There were no communal work bees to erect a barn or for large projects in New France. The Acadians, again, are an exception. They cooperated with each other, different families, to build and maintain the dikes that reclaimed land from tidal marshes in the area around the Bay of Fundy. Elementary education as it existed in the colony was primarily for boys. Girls were excluded from secondary schools for a fairly good reason. The secondary schools existed to prepare young men for the priesthood. Religious orders provided all the teachers. A secular teacher would be exceptionally rare. Parish priests instructed all children in the Christian catechism, but formal education generally had a very little impact on the population. Less than half the population of the colony could read or write. Writing one's signature might be the limit of literacy. Trades training by private apprenticeship, on the other hand, flourished in New France. So people tend to focus on institutional education, but again, relying on the notarial system, I found that this private system was quite robust and lasted throughout the French regime. Although Christian catechism was taught to every child, the religion of the lower ranks included magical practices and pagan superstitions. Latin, for example, the language of the Mass, was thought to be a magical tongue that could be used to obtain protection, cure an ailment, or break a spell. And that brings us to the business of witchcraft and magic. Dead livestock, a local hailstorm, mental problems, these were often attributed to witchcraft by the rural population. However, a replay of the Salem witch trials was avoided because the magistrates sent out from France regarded sorcerers and witches as frauds and did not sentence them to death. The judges would not give in to popular superstitions. So in one instance here, the social distance between the colonists and the magistrates was very beneficial. New France belonged to a very different world than the English colonies. And in many ways, it was closer to the Spanish American colonies with their aristocratic ethos, governmental and religious institutions, which included schools, hospitals, and homes for the aged. One could describe New France as a welfare state. The first hospital at Quebec was founded in 1639. Another one appeared at Montreal, and New Orleans was endowed with the same institutions. The first public hospital in the British American colonies was established in Philadelphia in 1751, much later. And the social institutions that the French colonies enjoyed were not as well spread in the English colonies. So one can describe New France as a humane, if authoritarian, colony. Now, to sort of wind it up to relate New France to later generations, the survival of French as an official language in Canada is the most obvious legacy of the French colony that was conquered by the British in 1760. There were other survivals: the Roman Catholic Church, the seigneurial landholding system, and French civil law. The last chapter in my book identified links between New France and the modern province of Quebec, and that proved to be very contentious. I believe that Quebec's welfare state was built on foundations laid by the Roman Catholic Church. In the 1960s, the province took over control of education and social services in Quebec from the church. And it accepted many of the obligations that went with that system of charity and social services. The current anti-clerical mood of Quebecers, however, makes it very unfashionable to acknowledge the church's charitable role. Quebecers would rather credit a social democratic ideology for the province's generous social and medical services. The struggle for cultural survival is a popular theme in French Canadian historiography, and yet the British administration after the conquest showed no interest in imposing the English language on the Canadiens. The British administration was far more concerned with the religion of the Canadiens, introducing the Church of England, the Protestant Church, and breaking all connections with the papacy. This, however, they failed to do. The British governors were generally fairly sympathetic to the Canadiens and refused to carry out many of the policies enunciated in London. Inexperience with political self-government and that preference for working with one's own kin slowed self-organization among the French Canadians. In the past, Quebecers looked to a paternalistic political leader to achieve goals. When the British government introduced an elected assembly to Quebec in 1791, it was met with suspicion because the Canadiens, like many French people, associated assemblies with taxation. They thought, wow, if you get an assembly, there's going to be increased taxation. There were uprisings in Lower Canada. That was another name for Quebec at a later date. Uprisings against British colonial rule. This was in 1837 and 1838. Popular lore in Quebec presents the rebellions as a national struggle to cast off the yoke of Anglo-Saxon domination and to establish a French-speaking republic. The paradox is that most of the military leaders in these uprisings were people who were not French Canadians. They were English speakers. One was a Swiss, one was an Irishman. Well, the Irish would love to get into any Donnybrook. And they were obviously motivated by an attraction for liberal democratic values. Another, well, oh, by the way, the uprisings were unsuccessful. Another overlooked factor inherited from New France was Quebec's civil law, which an Anglo-Irish governor preserved in the 1770s. Apart from Louisiana, private law elsewhere in North America is based on English common law. And common law rulings are guided by precedents, past judgments, and practical considerations. Quebec's civil code, however, is a list of general principles to guide the judgments. Deductive reasoning from abstract principles is more acceptable in Quebec than elsewhere, although rulings can be pragmatic as well. I'm not writing off the capacity of Franco-Quebecers to be pragmatic. Dogmatic reasoning, however, is there, and it was most recently manifested in Quebec's Bill 21, passed in 2019. And what Bill 21 did was that it declared that the province's government is secular and neutral in religious matters. So far, so good. However, it outlaws any visible identification of a person's faith if one is a public employee, whether it was be a teacher, a nurse, or a civil servant. And this year, a Muslim teacher was removed from the classroom for wearing a hijab. That has generally been received very poorly outside of Quebec. As you can see, the heritage of the French colony is a mixed one. Most groups have their own version of the past, usually self-serving, selective, and very flattering to themselves. Because the last governor of New France, the Marquis de Vaudreuil, was colonial born, it had been said that no office in the colonial administration was closed to Canadiens. My own statistical analysis showed that the proportion of colonists in the administration actually shrank over time. It did not increase. And Vaudreuil was an exception. Quebec nationalists do not appreciate accounts that contradict their patriotic myths. And I encountered a hostile reaction from some of them. And this is the hazard of insisting on history that is anchored in the surviving evidence from a variety of sources. On the other hand, English speakers from Quebec sent me congratulatory letters for identifying the origins of the traits they had observed in their French-speaking compatriots. So La Nouvelle France has had a very mixed reaction in Canada.